This video covers a real criminal case, one that has captivated the public's attention for nearly 70 years, and all information presented is sourced from public court records, official police reports, and verified news sources. The Babes in the Woods case is a haunting mystery that has gripped the community of Vancouver, British Columbia, since 1953, when two young boys were found murdered in the city's Stanley Park, their bodies left in a wooded area, leading to the case being dubbed as such. For nearly 70 years, the boys remained unidentified, and the investigation had gone cold, leaving behind unanswered questions that stretched across generations of Vancouver police detectives who passed the case file from one team to the next. The Babes in the Woods case began on January 14, 1953, when a Parks Board employee working in Stanley Park discovered the skeletal remains of two young boys in a densely wooded area near Beaver Lake, one of the park's more secluded spots, shielded by thick undergrowth and tall conifers. The remains were partially covered by a woman's brown leather aviator-style jacket, and a small hatchet was found at the scene, which investigators believed had been used as the murder weapon. A coroner's examination determined the boys had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull, and their ages were estimated at between 6 and 10 years old. The two boys were buried at a cemetery in New Westminster under a shared headstone that read "Two Unknown Boys," a stark inscription that would remain unchanged for decades, marking a grave that no family member ever visited. You're watching Dark Verdict, where we investigate the cases that haunt us, and the Babes in the Woods case is one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in Canadian history.
When the bodies were first discovered, the Vancouver Police Department launched a massive public appeal, distributing photographs of the clothing and personal items found at the scene to newspapers across British Columbia and beyond.
Officers canvassed schools, orphanages, and foster homes throughout the Lower Mainland, checking enrollment records and absentee lists for any boys matching the victims' descriptions.
Detectives also contacted law enforcement agencies in neighboring provinces and across the border in Washington state, hoping that a missing persons report had been filed somewhere outside their jurisdiction. Despite all of these efforts, not a single match was found, and the absence of any missing persons report matching the two boys only deepened the mystery. It was as though the children had existed in a gap in the public record, invisible to the institutions that should have known they were gone.
In the years immediately following the discovery, the Vancouver Police Department received dozens of tips from residents who believed they recognized the boys' clothing or recalled seeing children matching their general description in various neighborhoods around the city.
Each lead was investigated, and each one eventually reached a dead end. By the late 1950s, active investigation had largely ceased, though the file was never formally closed. The case sat in the cold case archives of the VPD, revisited occasionally when a new detective took an interest or when a member of the public called in with a theory.
Stanley Park itself became a kind of informal memorial, with locals who knew the story sometimes leaving flowers near the area where the boys had been found. In 1996, a significant step was taken when the boys' remains were exhumed from their New Westminster graves so that forensic scientists could attempt DNA extraction using techniques that had not existed in 1953.
At the time, DNA profiling was still a relatively new tool in Canadian criminal investigations, having first been used in a Canadian court in 1988. Investigators also commissioned forensic facial reconstructions, producing detailed clay models of what the boys may have looked like in life, and these images were released to the media in the hope of generating new leads. A dedicated tip line was established, and over the years hundreds of calls came in from across Canada, but none produced a confirmed identification. The DNA samples obtained during the exhumation were preserved, however, and this decision would prove critical more than 2 decades later. The breakthrough came in 2021 when the Vancouver Police Department partnered with Othram Incorporated, a forensic genomics laboratory based in the Woodlands, Texas, that specializes in building DNA profiles from degraded or extremely limited biological samples. Othram scientists employed advanced DNA extraction and sequencing methods to develop a usable genetic profile from the decades-old remains, and that profile was then uploaded to genealogical databases for comparison. Through investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that cross-references DNA data with publicly available family trees, analysts were able to trace the boys' lineage and ultimately identify them. The two boys were Derek and David Dalton, half-brothers who had been living in the Vancouver area in the early 1950s. The identification of Derek and David Dalton answered the question that had hung over the case for 68 years, but it also opened an entirely new chapter in the investigation.
Derek was approximately 6 years old at the time of his death, and David was approximately 7.
Once their identities were confirmed, investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing the boys' short lives, pulling records from schools, hospitals, and social services agencies across British Columbia. Detectives learned that the boys had lived in difficult and unstable circumstances, moving between addresses in the Vancouver area during a period when social safety nets for vulnerable children were far less developed than they are today. The boys had no extended family network that might have raised an alarm when they vanished, which helps explain why no missing persons report was ever filed on their behalf. With the boys now identified, the Vancouver Police Department formally reclassified the case as an active homicide investigation. Detectives focused their attention on individuals who had been part of the boys' household and immediate circle in the months leading up to January 1953. Through records and genealogical research, investigators developed a suspect, but that person was already deceased by the time the identification was made in 2021. Because the suspect could not be arrested, charged, or brought to trial, many details of the investigative theory have not been released to the public, and the VPD has indicated that certain evidence remains sealed pending any future developments. The department has acknowledged the frustration this causes but has stated that protecting the integrity of the record is paramount. The Babes in the Woods case is part of a broader wave of decades-old cold cases that have been reopened and advanced through genetic genealogy in recent years. The same investigative technique was instrumental in identifying the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, in Sacramento, California, in April 2018, when investigators matched crime scene DNA to a distant relative's profile on an open-access genealogy database. Since that landmark case, the method has been applied to hundreds of unidentified remains and unsolved homicides across North America. Othram alone has assisted law enforcement in more than 200 identifications since its founding in 2018, working with agencies in the United States and Canada to resolve cases that traditional investigative methods had been unable to crack. The case also echoes other crimes that have carried the same grim nickname across different countries and eras. In Brighton, England, in October 1986, 9-year-old Karen Hathaway and 9-year-old Nicola Fellows were found dead in Wild Park, and their murders became known as the Babes in the Wood case. A local man named Russell Bishop stood trial and was acquitted in 1987, but more than 3 decades later, in 2018, Bishop was convicted of both murders at a retrial where advanced DNA evidence linked him definitively to fibers found on the girl's clothing. In Winmore, Pennsylvania, in November 1934, 3 young girls were discovered deceased beneath a blanket in a patch of woodland, and that case too was labeled with the same name, drawing national attention and prompting one of the largest investigations in the state at that time. In Vancouver, the identification of Derek and David Dalton brought a measure of resolution to a case that had weighed on the city for nearly 7 decades. The headstone at the cemetery in New Westminster was updated to bear the boys' real names, replacing the inscription that had simply read 2 unknown boys for 68 years. For the detectives who had worked the case across multiple generations of the VPD's major crime section, the identification represented the fulfillment of a promise made to 2 children who had been abandoned in death just as they had been failed in life. The VPD has confirmed that the investigation remains technically open and that officers continue to review documentary and physical evidence in the hope of assembling as complete a record as possible of what happened in Stanley Park during the winter of 1953, so that the full truth of Derek and David's story can one day be set down.